There are so many games on the Nintendo Switch eShop, it's almost overwhelming. With an average of 30 new digital-only titles being released each and every week, it's pretty easy to let even the most interesting titles slip by. And with all these big-name physical releases to worry about, most of these eShop games are sadly going to be left to rot on your wish list. What I'd like to do is delve in and actually give some of these games a chance, and maybe, just maybe, I'll find a new favorite along the way. This time, I'm taking a look at Sega Ages' Wonder Boy Monster Land. I've been a fan of the Wonder Boy series for a while now, ever since I first played Dragon's Curse for TurboGrafx 16. There's quite a few of these games, and they're still getting made today, even after over 3 decades. Being a fan, it's only natural that I'd want to check out Monster Land. While it's not technically the first Wonder Boy game, it is the first game to establish a series identity most gamers are familiar with. Sega Ages' Wonder Boy Monster Land is based on the original arcade release of the game, rather than the more commonly known Master System version that was released in the US, which was known as Wonder Boy in Monster Land. Regardless, it's still the same game, aside from a few variations I won't bother getting into. The Sega Ages series is known for being a collection of perfect ports, with a few extra features added in, and this game is no different. But rather than rambling off a list of optional features, I'd prefer to jump straight in and talk about the core game itself, Wonder Boy Monster Land. The entire playable game area is situated in a small window, while the perimeter of the screen space is used to display vital information such as your points and life, what magic and items you have on hand, and a timer that comes in the form of an hourglass. The game begins and you immediately have control over the main character, who I'll call Tom Tom for the sake of simplicity. The first thing you'll do in Monster Land is enter a treehouse and talk to this character, who makes certain that you know that the country's fate depends on you. This is the first of many instances of poor translation you'll find throughout the game. Interestingly, the arcade version of Monster Land this game is based on was never released outside of Japan, meaning this is a brand new translation. The bad English is completely intentional, I guess to further establish that this game is a product of its time. Strangely, the US release of the Master System version was actually decently translated, making the decision to include new retro-flavored spelling errors in the Sega Ages version kind of an odd choice, but an amusing one nonetheless. Moving on, the character grants Tom Tom with his starting weapon, a short sword called Gradius that can be used to stab at enemies, which will be your primary form of attack for the entire game, and I don't use the word short lightly, as this weapon just barely stabs more than a few pixels in front of the player. This obviously means that you have to move extremely close to enemies and bosses to attack them. This isn't a huge deal at first since most enemies are fairly easy to dispatch of. Early game bosses pose a fair challenge, but with enough patience, it's not too hard to find your groove and properly time your stabs, but it doesn't take long before the difficulty ramps up significantly, and you'll find your tiny little sword will no longer cut it. No pun intended. Stronger swords are found by defeating optional bosses, which I'll get to in a bit, but it's not until much later in the game when you find the Excalibur, a sword with a longer reach. It's not much longer, and you'll still have to be nose to nose with your enemies just to be within striking distance, but at least it's something. Wonder Boy Monster Land is full of enemies that charge at you full speed, which means you'll have to quickly become a master of precisely timing your tiny stabs, lest you get tackled to death. Another viable strategy is just to mash the attack button over and over and accept the inevitable damage while you quickly work your way towards the next checkpoint. Speaking of checkpoints, when you run out of hearts, you respawn at the last checkpoint, but not without first entering a coin for another credit. This is an arcade game after all, which means you can't continue without offering us some coinage. Of course, seeing as this isn't an actual arcade machine, the game will happily pretend you're the richest kid in the world with an infinite amount of quarters and simply let you continue the game with a press of the X button. So basically, you have infinite lives, and you're gonna need them because this game isn't easy. In fact, it's nowhere close to being easy. Let me start back at the beginning. After getting your first sword, you'll immediately come across another treehouse. Inside, a character asks if you'd like a cocktail or a beer, both of which cost gold, which is most commonly dropped by defeated enemies and bosses. As is common in a game of this era, you don't really know what anything does until you try it out. Luckily, as with other Sega Ages ports, this game comes with a manual you can easily access from the main menu at any time. However, the manual isn't actually coded into the game. Instead, the game connects to the internet where you can then access a number of Sega Ages manuals. but no matter how many times I tried, I could never get past the country select. My internet is just fine, so I don't know what the problem is. Whatever the case, no manual for me. Luckily, the game is pretty simple to figure out just by playing it, but I would have preferred to have had that info going in, considering that the option is technically there. After practicing your sword stabs on a few enemies, you enter a third house that contains the first of this game's mini boss battles. More on that in a bit. He is pretty easy, and defeating him earns you a key that lets you move on to the second level, or round. The next round begins in a town with an assortment of shops, such as an armor shop or a hospital to restore your hearts and timer, but you shouldn't have much gold at this point in the game, so you'll have to budget. I entered a shoe store, but I wanted to see what else this town had to offer before making any hasty financial decisions, but I guess the shoe store owner had something against poor TomTom because he boarded up the doors the moment I left. Not wanting to get locked out of the shield store too, I went ahead and bought a shield I could afford. I don't think it needs to be said, but getting locked out of a shop in a game like this is just a confusing decision from a game design standpoint. Like, just why? Perhaps to keep you from grinding enemies for gold and to keep the game moving forward at a steady pace, each level has a timer as indicated by the hourglass in the corner of the UI. It's usually not too big of an issue, but I have died a few times thanks to the timer running out, even when I was rushing. The timer is less of a nuisance due to its functionality, as it is thanks to the ear-shattering noise it makes when the time is almost up.
Want to hear the most annoying sound in the world?
I can honestly say I don't think I've ever heard something so painfully annoying in a video game before. It's supposed to add to the player's urgency, similar to how the music will speed up in a Mario game, but this noise is downright stress-inducing. On a side note, I should set this as my wake-up alarm. No chance of falling back to sleep after hearing that. Also worth mentioning, the timer's purpose as a way to keep the player moving forward at a brisk pace actually seems a bit contradictory to the fact that the game isn't really meant to be beaten in under an hour. Just my theory, but I think it's possibly a holdover from Wonder Boy's Adventure Island origins. Later on in the second round is a platforming segment, and this is where you'll learn that Wonder Boy Monster Land ain't no Super Mario. To be fair, the game controls adequately and there's no instant death traps, bottomless pits, or fall damage in the game, so the game doesn't need to have super precise platforming controls. That said, I did manage to buy something from the shoe store this round. While it's definitely amusing to see TomTom running around in nothing but a pair of swanky pink boots, the boost and walking speed they offer do nothing for his traction, making platform jumping that much less precise. After dying at the boss and having to restart at the last checkpoint, I opted not to buy the boots and to just go barefoot instead. I guess it's time to talk about the bosses, huh? Each round has at least one boss, with additional bosses usually being optional. The reward for defeating optional bosses is too great to not make the effort, as this is the only way to get a new sword. As the manual states, try to imagine the shame as the villagers laugh and point, mockingly baiting that the mighty Wonder Boy buys his own sword like a common vulgarian. You don't come back from that. This is why you will not find them for sale in any shop. Well, at least there's an in-universe reason for it. The entirety of Wonder Boy Monster Land almost feels like a boss rush considering the amount of time you'll spend battling them. The levels outside of the bosses feel like they only exist to serve the boss battles. Enemies drop gold, which you'll need to buy armor and shields, which are only really useful against bosses, seeing how standard enemies don't pose that much of a threat. Enemies also drop gauntlets, which temporarily increase your sword damage, and helmets, which temporarily increase your damage taken. Bosses in this game are so difficult you'll need every boost you can get. In addition to gold and temporary armor, enemies also randomly drop magic. Magic comes in a few different forms: tornadoes, fireballs, lightning, and bombs, which aren't technically magic, but they function the same way. All of these are a form of ranged projectiles, with the exception of lightning, which attacks all enemies on screen. Because your sword is so embarrassingly short, you'll need to stock up on as much magic as possible if you want to have any chance against the game's more difficult boss battles. The early bosses are very difficult, to the point where I wonder how anyone in the arcades had enough coins to get past any of them. While they are difficult, they at least have somewhat discernible patterns. The battles may not be as well thought out as those in a Mega Man game, for example, but they're not unreasonable. I say this because it's not long before the bosses do become quite unreasonable. Most boss battles in Wonder Boy Monster Land use the same strategy. Start by unleashing every last bit of magic you have on you, then rush the boss with sword stabs while they bounce you around the screen like a game of racquetball and hope they die first. And you better hope you bought a revival medicine that restores your hearts after you run out, or your chances of victory are straight up laughable. About midway through the game, I came across an optional boss called Giant Kong. This guy completely obliterated me repeatedly. I lost to him so many times with no sign of getting anywhere close to beating him. He attacks by either ramming you or throwing a boulder that'll break into 3 if you don't manage to block it with your shield. After replaying the level what feels like a million times, I was lucky enough to have an enemy drop a revival medicine just before I reached the boss. I knew I had no chance without it, and if I lost again, I wouldn't be able to get it back, so that's when I created a save state just before the boss. Even then, I had to reload the save state countless times because the Giant Kong would just not die. I fought this dude for almost an entire hour before, by nothing else but sheer luck and perseverance, I miraculously managed to defeat him. In that hour of repetition, I never once felt like I was getting skilled at dodging his attacks or learning his movement pattern. I owe Giant Kong's eventual defeat to pure chance. A few rounds and a few relatively easy boss battles later, I ended up in round 8, an ice level with slippery ground and annoying enemies that throw ice cubes at you. These guys take way too many hits to defeat, and they often fall into the water, making it harder to attack them while they assault you with chunks of ice. There's also a small platforming section that's just needlessly annoying rather than presenting any sort of challenge. The details of this particular round stand out to me because, well, this is the last level I played. The boss, called the Hobgoblin, was simply too difficult to defeat. He jumps around sporadically and shoots off a rainbow laser beam that's all but impossible to block and deals crazy damage. I ended up consulting a guide to see if there's some way to make this easier. There wasn't, and I looked ahead a bit while I was at it. I was only on round 8 out of 11, and the guide was throwing away disheartening phrases like tremendously difficult. However, the nail in the coffin was the return of Giant Kong. He's the same as last time, but instead of throwing boulders, he spawns those annoying ice cube enemies I mentioned earlier. With as much trouble as I had fighting this guy the first time, I wasn't even gonna bother fighting a somehow more difficult version. Aside from all that, there was a sort of trading quest where a hidden character in one round would give you an item to trade with another hidden character in a later round. At some point, perhaps because I always felt compelled to rush thanks to the timer, I must have missed something because the trading quest went nowhere, and there's obviously no way to return to a previous round, or to even go back to earlier parts of the round you're in for that matter. All in all, Wonder Boy Monsterland is a charming little game that has a lot going for it, as is evident by its numerous sequels. Sadly, Monsterland is probably the worst of the bunch. I've beaten my fair share of highly difficult games from the same era, such as Castlevania and Zelda 2, but this game is on another level when it comes to challenge, and unlike those other games, the challenge here never feels fair. Wonder Boy is a great series featuring some truly outstanding gems, but this is not one of them. I can only recommend SEGA Ages Wonder Boy Monsterland if you're already a fan of the series like myself, and you want to experience the series in its early stages. Just be warned, you may find the experience isn't a pleasant one. My heart aches for all the Japanese kids in the 80s who spent their real-life savings just trying to beat freaking Wonder Boy Monsterland. Anyways, thanks for taking the time out of your day to watch this review. If you liked it, then please give it a like. Again, thank you for watching.